Well, it's always a joy for me to welcome our friends at the two theater campuses, as we say, at Watkins, Glen, and Fresh Start Arnot Mall. We're happy that you're here. This being the last weekend of January, I wanted to one more time remind you about our Christmas offering that began last December and continues through January 31st, it says on the green envelope that you probably have in your program. Just wanted to say in your program you'll see that we're about halfway to what our goal had been. So if you'd like to help us take another step toward our goal of $15,000, that would be great. Whatever we receive is more than we had before, and our money received in this year's Christmas offering will be allocated three ways between a memorial for John McMorrow in Cuba and the Border Buddies Mission House paying toward the mortgage, and also the food ministry. So we're excited to be able to make a significant contribution to each of those very worthwhile causes. This week we continue the story connecting God's upper story to our lower story. We're in chapter 18. We're moving along through the Old Testament. Daniel is the focus this week, and as you read from the story, chapter 18, I would ask you the question, will you dare to be a Daniel? And I'm reminded of a song that I guess I sang back as a kid. The words of the chorus were, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. And so we can learn a lot from Daniel, but to give you a little bit of the historical perspective or context for Daniel, I would like to read from the 137th Psalm. And you have a couple verses in your notes that we're going to come back and I'll have you read those with me. But reading the first 6 verses of Psalm 137, this was written at a time when the people of Israel have been deported. They have been exiled from their beloved country, the land, the promised land that because of the discipline that they required, because they had been so unfaithful, God had taken them from their land, had allowed them to be taken from their land by the hated Babylonians. And that was a bitter pill to swallow, to think that God would use those despised Babylonians to pull off God's discipline on them. And so there they are in Babylon, and it says this in the 137th Psalm, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of those songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. So they have been devastated. They're terribly discouraged and demoralized to be off there in this hostile territory, and then to have their captors, their tormentors, sing us one of your great songs. You know, it's just like throwing salt in the wounds. And so we have in your notes those words, and like to have you read them with me. Beside the rivers of Babylon, we thought about Jerusalem, and we sat down and cried, how can we sing about the Lord here in a former land? And that's the 137th Psalm. That parallels the book of Lamentations that we talked about last week. Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations. We don't know for sure who wrote this psalm, but it's a song of lamenting and sorrow. And so that's the kind of environment that Daniel lived in. And Daniel is one of those people, there's very few of them in the Bible, where all we see about him is good. We don't see, in most cases, we see people with their warts and all. Well, Daniel is an upstanding man of integrity, kind of like Joseph, you know, several centuries before. They are men of integrity who loved God, and we don't see their faults. Maybe, I'm sure they weren't perfect. Jesus is the only one to be perfect, but these guys were right up there, if you will. We're going to be in Daniel today looking at two very well-known stories, and the lion's den and the fiery furnace. And so I think you're going to find that these are somewhat familiar, even if you didn't realize how they fit into history's context. And that's my hope today, is to give you a little bit of the historical perspective on where Daniel and his writing comes to play. It says there in your notes, Daniel 1, verses 3 through 8, the king, and this king's name was Nebuchadnezzar. This king Nebuchadnezzar ordered his chief of staff to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. We come to learn that they're renamed, that Daniel we know him by Daniel, but these other 3, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, become Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Say those with me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We had a little 3-year-old boy that said Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go. But it's Abednego. And they were 4 upstanding citizens of Judah who have been exiled and deported to Babylon. But the king of Babylon saw qualities in these. They took the cream of the crop away from their homeland, because they were the ones they were concerned if there was going to be an insurrection or a revolt, you didn't want the leader type material there. So they far removed them. But now they're going to try to make the most of that by training them up in the ways of Babylon. So these 4 young men were chosen, it says, all from the tribe of Judah. Daniel was determined not to defile himself. Daniel appears to be their leader or their spokesman. Of the 4, Daniel's the top guy. Daniel made up his mind to eat and drink only what God had approved for his people to eat. And Daniel asked the king's chief official for permission not to eat the food and wine served in the royal palace. To the strict Jew, keeping the Jewish diet requirements was very important. They kept kosher, we might say today, and they did not want to pollute themselves and their diet by taking in all the rich foods of the Babylonians. Diet was very important to them. Diet mattered, if you will. A few of you, and I bet there's people on each of our campuses that have done what we've called the Daniel Plan for Growth Group. Anybody do the Daniel Plan? It's pretty healthy, isn't it, that Daniel diet? So they were given permission to follow the Daniel Plan, if you will. And to read from the story, page 254 in this week's lesson, I'd like to just read a brief excerpt. It tells us here that Daniel was gifted to interpret the meaning of dream images, but neither he nor his 3 buddies were authorized to bow down before idols. There was one thing they refused to adapt to. That was the foreign worship practices that violated their commitment to God. So they did not want to partake of the foreigners' diet, neither did they want to worship their idols and their gods. In that regard, these 4 were holdouts, malcontents, lawbreakers. Nebuchadnezzar decided to erect a statue some 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. When the people were ordered to bow low and worship this statue, 3 men stood tall and refused to comply. The king was not happy. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to worship this 90-foot tall statue. Imagine that's 90 feet would be about 9 stories. That'd be the size of Flannery Towers or Villa Serene, if you know those towers. It's right up there close to that same kind of height. 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. They were required to bow down and worship this idol that the king had made. And that did not go over well with the king. So we see in your notes that King Nebuchadnezzar said to Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, "Is it true you're not willing to bow down before this idol?" And they said, "No, we cannot do that." He says, "If you continue to refuse to bow down and worship my gods and my statue, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" They, meaning Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. This God will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. And so they refuse. They just blatantly say, this is wrong. We're not going to worship this idol that you have built. I love it where they say, God will rescue us from your power, your majesty, but even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you that they have that integrity that no matter what the outcome, we're not going to do this. We know what's right. Last week, the worship band sang a song that the song is Trust in You, and I asked Sarah to give me the words to the chorus. The words to that song say this: when you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. So they're saying no matter what, I'm going to trust in our God. Those words became very meaningful to me. Some of you may remember my friend Ron DeWitt. Ron passed about 3 years ago, I think this month. And shortly before he died, Ron died a tough, lingering death to cancer. I went out and I spent a few days with him. And he referred to this chapter of Daniel where he said, I believe that God can heal me, but if he doesn't, I still trust in God. And that made Nebuchadnezzar furious. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. It tells us that he tied the 3 up in ropes, and the soldiers went to throw them in, but the furnace was so hot, not only did they get thrown in, but the soldiers that did it died because of the heat. And then Nebuchadnezzar is watching what's happening within this furnace. It says, suddenly he jumped up in amazement. Look, he said, weren't there 3 men that we threw in there? Well, I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god, or another translation, the 4th looks like a son of the gods. And so picking up again in the story, page 256 this time, you might want to write the page number down. You can look at this for yourself. It says that Nebuchadnezzar approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. The satraps, prefects, governors, royal advisors all crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, and we find this in your notes, praise the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted him. They defied the king and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. So they made quite an impression. They inspired this king to see the devotion of these people. And we pick this up again in the story. There's a word of explanation. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. They were rewarded, and they were given a great place of prominence at that point. So we're called to be like those 3, to dare to be just like them. And then if you read the rest of that story in Daniel, you'll find that Nebuchadnezzar has his ups and his downs, and he went crazy for a time, and then he was restored to the kingdom. And then he was followed by the next king named Belshazzar. And it's Belshazzar. We have that expression in our language called the handwriting on the wall. You saw the handwriting on the wall. Well, that actually comes from the Bible. Did you know that? And it's a party that this Belshazzar is having with Babylon. And suddenly they see, it's terrifying, they see this handwriting on the wall. And it's Daniel there that interprets that vision, that what they saw. And as he's telling Belshazzar what it means, that the Persians are about to take over Babylon, it happened just as that as he's saying it. And so Daniel transcends Babylon. He's taken prisoner to Babylon, and then Babylon falls to Persia. Modern day, that's Babylon is Iraq, Persia is Iran, and Persia overtakes Babylon, and Daniel, with his integrity, rises to the top again. And it goes on to tell us that there were 120 officials of the king. Satraps is one word they use for that. And that of 120 of these officials, there were 3 selected to be the top 3 of the 120. Daniel was one of them. And then it tells us that Daniel was on his way to being number 1. And that's when the other 119 of them, if you will, realized, hey, this guy really is, there was a lot of competition and jealousy. And they conspired together. What can we do to bring this guy down? And it tells us in Daniel 6, 3 through 5, Daniel proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers, satraps. His adversaries concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So they know how devoutly religious this Jewish Daniel is, and they saw in him what I like to call sometimes a long obedience in the same direction. They see his integrity, and they're trying to use that against him. And so they conspire together to get the king, this King Darius, to issue a law, a decree. And it's a decree of the Medes and the Persians. Have you ever heard of that? That means it can never be changed. And so they get this king to declare this law that can never be changed, that everybody in his empire needs to bow down and worship him. And of course they know Daniel won't do that. So it tells us here in Daniel 6, 10 and 11, when Daniel learned that his adversaries had persuaded the king to sign a law forbidding him from praying to God, Daniel went home. What did he do? He knelt as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. So that wasn't about to deter Daniel from that faith relationship that he developed over his life. Apparently 3 times a day was key for him. I'm still trying to work at that. You know, I try to more than once a day, I try to find a second time in the day. I'm still working on the 3rd time, I got to tell you. I don't succeed at that every day. But that was the secret to Daniel's integrity, I believe, and to his success. Just like we saw with Joseph, remember before, we see Daniel developing this relationship with God, that he very consistently prayed 3 times a day. It was no secret to his adversaries that he did that, and they were trying to use that against him. So Daniel gets this word that he's going to die. And what does he do? He prays. He continues his habit of praying. I was just remembering a couple of weeks ago that false alarm that affected the state of Hawaii when they got that text alert on their phones that there was an incoming missile. This is not a drill. And the people had 38 minutes to find out that it really was a false alarm. What would that have done to you if you were there in Hawaii at that time? I was trying to put myself in that place. Now, there was one guy who was on the golf course. He just kept on golfing. You know, I think that's I know there's some of you avid golfers out there, but I'm not sure that's the way I'd want to spend the last few minutes. Maybe John Dunlap now, I don't know. He might go for the golf right then. But we have to be ready to go on a moment's notice. And I think how it did not faze Daniel. He says, "Oh, what am I going to do? I'm going to keep praying." You know, and we see then in 6:16 of Daniel. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. Then King Darius said to him, "May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you." Interesting that the king he was kind of forced to go through with this decree and to throw Daniel into the lion's den. But what's he say? "May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you." I wish you the best, Daniel. You know, I got to do this, but I hope you're going to be okay. Now, picking up right near the end of this week's chapter, the king waited all night. And it says at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their families. Before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For this God is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." And then they tell us at the end of this chapter, even in exile, a remnant of God's faithful people was growing. The prophet Jeremiah was now dead, but perhaps Jeremiah's message still rang in their hearts, the message of God's ultimate compassion and the promise of returning to their homeland. Though Jeremiah had prophesied a cloud of gloom and doom, this weeping prophet of Judah had not ended the story in a minor key. Behind the pages of ruin and loss was one bright page of mercy, one last word of restoration that was bound up in the loving character of God. This is what the Lord says, "I will save you." And so after 70 years of exile and punishment and discipline, the Jews came back again. And so that's where Daniel fits in the story. We have those four major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and to appreciate that those very well-known stories that come from the book of Daniel, how they fit in together. Now I'd like to take the opportunity to fast forward with you to the New Testament again, to Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 5, part of the Sermon on the Mount, where he says this. I'm going to read it out loud if you follow along with me. "You are the salt of the earth, but what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless." Now read the next part with me. "For you are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father." And where is this passage? Matthew 5:13-16. We're called to dare to be a Daniel, and that means to let our light shine to our world, just like Daniel's life shone to the people of his day. And where does that light come from? What is the source of that light? I would suggest that it wasn't in Daniel. I think he would say that. But it was in God who shone his light through Daniel. We're really more called to be a reflector or a mirror of the light of God. And that's what we see in Daniel and in those three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Daniel had this desire to be the light for God, and he refused to be conformed to the world around him. And he had the courage to remain faithful no matter what. I think of those words of the king in Daniel 6:16, where he said, "May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you." So may we be a witness to those around us, whether we live or whether we die, whether the Lord saves us from the fiery furnace or we perish in the fire. May our faithfulness shine to our world around us. Daniel was the real deal, if you will. I have a plaque that maybe one of you gave this to me. I can't remember where the source of this, but I have this at home and I brought it along here today. Can you see it? "Faith is a bird that feels the light and sings when dawn is still dark. And I think we see that in Daniel, that that's the kind of faith that he exhibited, that even though things were very dark, he could sing his praise to God because God was in control. Let us pray together. Help us, God, as we this week reflect on Daniel and his example, to dare to be like him in the way we live before our world. For Jesus' sake, amen.